everybody, and welcome back to The Thoughtful Therapist. It's a place for reflection and thinking about thinking. Today is episode 7. I'm not good enough. The primary negative cognition. Let's take this one thought at a time. There's a sentence that shows up in a bunch of different forms. And sometimes it sounds like, I'm a bad father. I can't get sober. I don't deserve your praise. But in my experience, if you follow those thoughts far enough through the timeline, they tend to lead back to something deeper, something more vague, more general, more hard and absolute, something that you can't even really question. I'm not good enough. Now, I don't know if psychology as a whole would say it exactly like that, but in my experience, that's the core belief that a lot of these other thoughts grow out of. Now, I want to say up front that this is an episode that leans a little bit more into structure and skill than previous ones. So remember just to take what's useful, take what makes sense, and feel free to leave the rest at the door. This one is also a little bit more personal, meaning that I'm going to be leaning a little bit more on my clinical expertise. Not because I have all the answers, but because I've seen this one a lot. And now these are what we call maladaptive thoughts. And yeah, I know it's a clinical term. If I had to put it simply, these are the thoughts that probably made sense at one point, but now kind of start working against us. So when I'm sitting in my counseling chair, meeting someone for the first time, one of the very first things I'm trying to do is understand this. How much value does this person place on themselves? Because if that number is low, then kind of everything else starts to follow, right? We start to lose autonomy, dignity, responsibility, even personal agency. And it also tends to be indicative of how willing this person may or may not be to fight for themselves, because counseling is kind of that. Now, I want to be clear about something. It's never my goal to just tell someone to think positive. Now, that can work, but only for a little bit, right? So if I were to sit across from someone and just blow sunshine and rainbows up their butt every day for 8 weeks, yeah, they might get some benefit out of it. But what happens when something difficult happens? They would just fall right back down without having learned any useful or real skills, because nothing underneath of it has actually changed. So what I'm trying to do is to come up with a more grounded reality instead of positive or negative, but just accurate. Because reality generally has one really big advantage. If you want to change something, you need to know where you actually are. It's like the little map in the mall that with the sticker on it that says you are here. Okay, so how do we spot these thoughts? Well, first off, they're usually really vague. Take, I'm not good enough, for example. I think it just means I just suck. And that's not really a direction. That's just a way to shut down. So instead of trying to fix every version of the thought, let's go straight to the source, right? So I'm not good enough. Okay. Well, the first problem is that's not even a full sentence. Not good enough for what? Because leaving it vague lets it kind of just apply to everything, right? It just goes back to I suck. And that's awfully convenient. Because first off, it's almost certainly just not true. But it becomes a reason not to try, not to act, not to take responsibility. So one of the things that I like to help people do is to define them. Because the moment we define these things, they shrink. Let's say it becomes, I'm not good enough to be a husband. Now we can start asking, well, why? Prove it. Make it make sense. And a huge portion of the time, it just doesn't. And then we flip it. What does good enough actually look like? Now compare. Where are you actually different from good enough? Because now you don't just have this like belief that I'm not good enough. You have this actual roadmap. And notice what happened there. We didn't just challenge the situation. We challenged the belief underneath it. I had a client once who was really depressed and really believed that he was just not good enough for anything. He had stopped trying on just about everything. And we started with this very same question: not good enough for what? And as soon as I asked that question, I'll never forget, his mouth just dropped. He was like, I literally have never thought about that. And as soon as we slowed it down like that, you could really start to feel the pressure start to come off. And it turned out what he actually believed, that he wasn't good enough to find love. So we had something to focus on, and we just stayed there. We made it specific. We asked, what does good enough actually look like? Right? And we came up with kind, funny, responsible. Well, for him, he's a gentleman, so tall, someone who's actively trying, someone who shows up, someone who's working towards goals. And we just went down this list that we created. And one by one, he started checking boxes. Some stronger than others, some were still works in progress. But by the end of it, he kind of had to admit he actually met a vast majority of these criteria. Now, the belief didn't just disappear, but it did lose something. It lost that stank, because instead of, I'm not good enough to be loved, it shifted to, I just haven't found the right person yet. But I'm not fundamentally broken. I can keep trying. And you could literally see it. His shoulders dropped, his breathing changed. And that's kind of one of the cool things that happens when you take one of these thoughts about ourselves that's vague and turn it into something specific. Because most of the time, the monster under the bed shrinks a lot when you turn the lights on. Now, let's take another example. I can't get sober. So I've worked in addiction settings for many years with teens, with adults, and even in prison. And I heard this one like a lot. So I started asking, like, what does that actually mean? What are you saying to yourself? Because logically, of course you can. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's incredibly difficult, but it's not impossible. So what are we really saying? And it came out to something like, I'm scared to get sober, or I failed so many times, or I just don't know how yet, or even I don't want to. And those are honest statements. And that honesty gives us something to work with, because I can't puts the failure in front of the attempt. And I think what it's actually saying is something like, I'm just not going to get sober. And it's no one's fault. It's just going to happen that way. And it's clever, because now they don't have to try. But now failure is expected. And it's funny, right? That last one, it's such a sticking point with this specific one. I don't want to get sober. It's such a difficult thing for people to say out loud, right? Because I don't know, there's some level of shame carried with it. Like, I can't believe I'm choosing this life willingly. But there's still this cool thing that comes out at the end. Despite the shame and guilt or whatever, there's this wonderful thing. Just because you don't really want to do it doesn't mean you won't, and doesn't mean you can't. I do things I don't want to do all the time. Not wanting to doesn't mean you won't. And if you follow that one far enough, it usually connects back to that same, I'm not good enough. I'll give you a personal example, because this one shows up for me, actually. When my daughter was younger, bedtime was brutal. Like an hour and a half every night, stories, songs, laying with her until she will fall asleep. And she would fight the entire time. And when I say fight, I mean, she'd pull on her ear, she'd find a stuffed animal to play with, she would talk, she would do anything she could to not fall asleep. And when she finally fell asleep, I'd leave the room, take a deep breath, slide down her bedroom door, and think to myself, oh my gosh, thank you, she's asleep. And immediately after that thought, the thought would hit me. Oh, what is wrong with me? She just wants to spend time with me. Why am I rushing this? What a bad dad. But if I slow that down in any level, right? Like, I just spent 90 minutes showing up for her. So where does that thought come from? That wasn't really about bedtime, was it? That was that same thought again. Just, I'm not good enough for her. I'm broken. Something's wrong with me. And here's something else I've noticed. We take those behaviors and turn them into identities. That was that same thought again. I'm not good enough. And this is something that I had to fight with every day. for a few months before I finally got it into my head. I'm not a bad dad. I'm a frustrated dad. That time is really difficult, but that's okay. I'm human. And it maybe even made me a little bit better. Because think about what happens if I allow that I'm just a bad dad thought to settle. What would I do tomorrow under the guise of if I'm just a bad dad? It's not my fault. It's just who I am. And that was kind of scary because I'm not those things. Just like you're good enough. And there's something I've noticed when we take these behaviors, these small failures, and we turn them into identities. I failed becomes I'm a failure. I'm a frustrated father sometimes turns into I'm a bad dad. I lied becomes I'm a liar. I feel anxious right now becomes I'm just a really anxious person. And fair enough. Okay. But how much? How much really? So let's take lying just as an example. Because I remember hearing something, and I don't know if the number is exact, but it was something like the average person lies, it was something like 3 times in every 10 minutes of full conversation. Now, not really big lies, but, small ones, like something like saying, what's one I hear a lot, and I probably do with some frequency as well, is, oh, I read that somewhere when you really just heard it on a podcast or on ChatGPT told you. So if that's even close to true, how much are you actually lying? Because if someone lied like 30% of the time, I'm not even sure you could have a conversation with them. So we're probably not talking about that. So we're talking about what? A handful of times a day? Now all of a sudden we're starting to measure this. And if you can do that, then you can start to change it. Think about this, just 10% less would change everything over time. And the same thing is true with our emotions. I'm anxious, I'm depressed. Okay, how much? Because it's important to note, 0 anxiety would actually be a really big problem. Same with 0 depression. You start to look, off. So the goal can't be 0, but we treat it like it is. And when we do that, it becomes an identity instead of an experience. Perfect isn't just unattainable. It's equally as vague as the negative cognitions. And they're really hard to work with because of that. So why is this idea so sticky? I think that maybe it's just really efficient. It explains everything. Why didn't that relationship work? Oh, because I'm not good enough. Why didn't I get the job? Same answer. Why do I feel anxious in groups? Because somewhere underneath it, I'm just not good. And it becomes this kind of master key. It unlocks every disappointment, every failure, every moment of rejection. And it does so without needing any new evidence. Once that thought is in there, it just runs. It runs in the background and it starts to color everything. Because when someone truly believes they're not good enough, they don't just feel bad. They stop applying. They stop risking. They stop speaking up. They stop trying. And eventually the belief starts creating the very life that seems to confirm these thoughts. And this is where this gets a little bit uncomfortable, because it usually doesn't start as something huge and negative. It normally starts in something like a protective factor. Because if I can just tell myself that I'm not good enough today, then I don't have to risk trying and failing in front of people. I don't have to put myself out there. I can stay small. I can stay safe. So yeah, it hurts, but it also protects. It protects us from hope and from disappointment alike. And I think that's why it's so hard to shake. Because it's not just a thought. It's something that worked at one point. It's a survival strategy. And it's just not useful anymore. And honestly, because of that, I think that this is an area that really deserves some compassion. Because a lot of these beliefs don't just appear out of nowhere. They were built slowly through disappointments, failures, rejections, criticisms, and all sorts of fear. And sometimes it takes years. So challenging them isn't just learning a new skill. Sometimes it's actually learning how to like stop protecting yourself from life, which is so counterintuitive. So when we are down on ourselves, it can be useful to slow our thoughts. See if you can define what we are saying to ourselves and attempt to explain why we're saying it and determine if it makes sense. What is the purpose of this statement? Because we don't say anything to ourselves that doesn't have any purpose. But why am I saying this? I've always liked to say, make it make sense or make it go away. Now, again, this is not a prescription, but just a new potential way of perceiving ourselves with a kinder, more gentle focus to create a new frame of understanding. Some people stay in painful beliefs because they feel safer than the possibilities of their futures. One of the things I like to do is what we call the friendship test. So if we're wondering if one of the things we're telling ourselves is maladaptive or negative cognition, one of the best ways to go about starting to work through that process is, what if you were to tell a friend how you were thinking about yourself then? What would they say? Or better yet, what if your friend came to you and told you that I'm a bad dad? What would they say? Would they let you stew in it? Would they provide examples why that's not true? Would they support you? Would they care for you with compassion and clarity? And if so, why do we allow ourselves to talk to ourselves in any different way? You're just as deserving. Now, I know that this episode is different from previous ones, but this is a topic I'm really passionate about. And I've seen what a change in self-concept can do naturally and painlessly to change your life. It can just strip some of the negative thoughts away and replace them with tangible hope. And my intention here has been an attempt to thoughtfully describe this process that I've seen help people. And it's not a rule anyone has to follow or anything like that. There's a bunch of other ways to do this. But after all, there are always exceptions to rules, and there's a lot of gray area out there. These are just my thoughts. And here's the last thing I'll leave you with. Once you learn how to question these beliefs, whether they're the ways we talked about today or some other way, the hardest part isn't the questioning itself. It's choosing not to slip back into that willful ignorance. It's easier to stay small and familiar than to keep doing the work of seeing yourself more clearly. The real test isn't just learning the skill, it's choosing it again and again and again, and choosing not to forget it. So I said this in my very first episode, and it's something that I really hope sticks with my listeners. You're worth it. You are not all those bad things. I hope that this episode is useful. And thank you for thinking it through with me, the Thoughtful Therapist. I'd like to give a shout out to Synergy Health Group for supporting me in this podcast. Their help has been monumental in being able to do this. So thank you guys so much. If you have any mental health needs or know someone that could use someone to talk to, Synergy Health Group in Florida can really help. Thank you so much.